Welcome to BIV Today, the daily business show from the journalists at Business in Vancouver. I'm Hayley Woodin. 2020 was a tumultuous year economically, to say the least. And while COVID-19 vaccines are giving many of us hope, there are still challenges ahead. My guest today is Jock Finlayson. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia. Jock, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year to you as well. I want to get your sense of where we ended the year. We went through 2020 not unscathed. How did we finish the year, economically speaking?
I think it's really a mixed picture depending on where you're working, where you're investing, the sort of circumstances of your household or your business. Just to kind of back up for a sec, you described 2020 as tumultuous. That's a great adjective. It's important to note that the real savage decline in employment and economic activity occurred in that kind of March to June period. So it's really mostly in the kind of late first quarter and through most of the second quarter of 2020. That's when the wheels fell off, and we were really in a world of tremendous uncertainty at that time. Since then, the economy, certainly in BC, has come back. Its activity has snapped back. Employment has come back quite strongly, and we're in a much better place at the end of 2020 than we were kind of halfway through. So I guess that's the first point I'd make. The second point, though, is because this has been such a strange economic downturn and recovery, and because we're still caught up in the global pandemic, it's not over. In fact, we're right in the middle of it, I would say. The outlook is unusually cloudy, and there's more uncertainty, I think, than we would normally expect. But we ended the year in a better place than we were halfway through. And as you pointed out, with the vaccines being developed, as we kind of look through 2021, I think there is some reason to be optimistic that, especially in the second half of 2021, we'll begin to get closer to kind of a normal economic environment. We're certainly not there yet.
You mentioned we're, of course, still in the middle of this pandemic. Why do you think the second wave hasn't been as economically severe as, say, the first wave when it hit us back in March, April?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, the main reason is, people were panicking. Policymakers, decision makers didn't know what we were dealing with at the time of the first wave. I recall vividly giving a speech to a room full of 300 federal public servants on February 26, 2020, and COVID was already here at that point, but we didn't know it. But everybody was reading about cruise ships in China, watching some of the early evidence out of Italy, and there was a real sense of anxiety. But there I was in a room full of 300 people giving a speech. And of course, a month later, it would have been unimaginable that I'd go into a room of 10 people, never mind 300. So that's how quickly this thing kind of came in, hijacked the agenda, and people sort of panicked. Now I wouldn't say it's a chronic condition, but we're learning to kind of live with it. And governments, I think, have realized that unless the infection rates absolutely skyrocket, you don't want to shut down the entire economy, because that obviously is truly devastating for workers, for households, and for taxpayers in the long run. So I think we're doing a decent job, certainly in BC. I think the government has handled it quite well in trying to keep the activity underway wherever possible, while still providing, public health precautions. So it's a balancing act. Obviously, if you wanted to eradicate COVID-19 and that was the only thing on your agenda, you would shut literally everything down and essentially lock people into their houses. We haven't gone that route, and I think it's been the right decision so far.
What would you say at this point in time are the biggest weaknesses in our economy and the biggest strengths, if there are any?
Yeah. Well, because this downturn affected the economy in a very different way than we traditionally have seen with business cycles and recessions, the negative impact has really been heavily concentrated in what I would call consumer-facing industries. So obviously, accommodation, food services, leisure, entertainment, everything related to travel and tourism. These are the areas of the economy that are still underwater to a significant extent. A lot of the other sectors have rebounded. In a normal recession, it's actually construction and manufacturing that typically take the biggest hit. Service industries tend to be much more resilient and often don't experience a recession during an economic down cycle. This time around is completely different. Manufacturing has come back, construction has held its own, and the downturn in employment and business activity has been heavily concentrated in services. And that was true 6 months ago, and it's still true at the end of the year.
I want to ask you about all of these government support programs, benefits, subsidies that we've seen, and what happens when governments decide to phase those out. What should we expect when that time comes?
Well, it's a great question. We've seen a truly unprecedented policy response, especially by the federal government. It's important to note in BC, although the provincial government implemented its own COVID action plan and has taken a number of steps to try and support businesses and workers and households, the lion's share of the fiscal support provided in British Columbia has been off the federal government's balance sheet, not the province. And just to give you one example of that, the CERB, the Emergency Response Benefit Program that was announced in the spring, that paid workers $2,000 a month, almost with no documentation required. This program alone pumped over $10 billion into British Columbia over the spring and summer until it wound up at the end of September. We had 1.2 million British Columbians at one point or another during that period were actually collecting CERB, which is a staggering number. There's only 2.3 million British Columbians in the labor force here. So we had half the labor force, if you will, collecting CERB, even though employment didn't decline by anywhere near 50% during the worst of the COVID kind of phase one. So CERB, coupled with the emergency commercial rent support, the wage subsidy program, the Trudeau government pumped money into support for senior citizens. There was a $300 grant given to every senior citizen. I don't think that was terribly necessary. Support for post-secondary students, that was necessary. But you add it all up, we're talking multiple tens of billions of dollars just flowing into British Columbia, I would say, during kind of 2020, mostly off the federal government's balance sheet. It was the right thing to do. It was messy. It wasn't, targeted perhaps in an optimal way, but we were dealing with a very uncertain environment, and we have to give our policymakers some slack, I think, in that context. But it can't continue. We will see, I think, a gradual relaxation of these programs. They're not going to end all at once. The Trudeau government seems inclined to extend them, taking account of the second wave of COVID-19 that has got the country firmly in its grip as we kind of move through the winter. But as we get to the spring and into the summer, I think you'll see these programs largely wound down. And hopefully the private sector economy can kick back into gear sufficiently to keep people employed and get back to something that looks like normal. But, there is a big question mark over that, I think, in the minds of many people. It's probably the biggest uncertainty we've got in forecasting for 2021.
What are some of the other things you'll be watching in 2021, or you might expect to see, say, in the first half of the year?
Yeah, a great question. Again, a couple of things. The Canada-US border. We're getting used to the fact it's closed, but it truly is extraordinary that for the last almost 10 months, it's been essentially impossible to cross the land border, and very, very few people have been crossing using other modes of transport. How long does it stay closed? That has a big bearing on any recovery scenario for the travel and tourism economy. I'm pessimistic on that, I have to confess. I think it's going to be well into 2021, hopefully by the summer, but I'm not convinced it's the case. It really depends on the case profile of COVID-19. Right now, cases are skyrocketing in the United States, and they're rising steeply in much of Canada also. So that is not an environment in which we're going to see the border open anytime soon. A second thing is interest rates. Although central banks have made it very clear, including the Bank of Canada, that they're going to keep their policy rates pinned to zero effectively all through 2021 and likely 2022 as well. Market interest rates are a different matter. Those are set in the marketplace by buyers and sellers of securities, by savers, by borrowers, by lenders. And we are seeing, we've already seen some increases in market interest rates over the past few months. And if there's an expectation of a strong recovery, which is something we should talk about, you could see market interest rates move up further, even though policy rates will be at record low levels. And so that's something that could really inject some interesting kind of impacts into the financial environment and the broader economy, maybe by the second half of 2021.
On the topic of a strong recovery, which I think many people would love to see, what components need to be in place either from a policy perspective or even from, say, a confidence perspective among business leaders?
Well, the most important thing for a strong recovery to materialize, and we already had a strong recovery, by the way, in the second half of 2020. So we're not at the bottom of the downturn. We've actually regained, for example, the vast majority of the jobs that were lost in the spring and early summer have now been regained in British Columbia, over 90% of all those positions. So a lot of the recovery has actually already happened. To get the rest of it in place and get back to a positive growth trend, the most important thing is to get the virus under control. It's an issue for health authorities and epidemiologists, not economic forecasters. I mean, unless we get the virus under control and much more of the population vaccinated quickly, the economic scenario is not very good. And I think for the first quarter of 2021, we could actually see negative numbers in terms of real GDP growth in both the US and Canada, because so much of North America is gripped in a very serious second wave, which is worse in many respects than the first wave. So we've got to get past that before I think one can talk about a strong recovery. Assuming that the virus gets under control due to warmer weather coupled with a growing population, a growing share of the population being vaccinated, I think by the second quarter and certainly by the third quarter, we'd be looking at a further rebound in activity. And it's those consumer-facing industries that have borne the brunt of the downturn that will need to recover if the overall economy is going to enjoy a strong rebound. So again, the travel, tourism economy, accommodation, food services, leisure, recreation, arts and entertainment, these are the sectors that are really badly underwater today. And to get the overall economy growing again in a sustained way, they need to come back online in a way they have not so far.
I don't want to jinx anything 5 days into the new year, but it sounds like there may be some reasons to be cautiously optimistic that it's going to be a better year.
Yeah, I think so. 2020 was one for the record books on every level. Although, again, I would note that we recovered most of the lost jobs. The stock market came back to record highs. I mean, it wasn't all bad, but certainly it was unprecedented what we went through. 2021, I think the ingredients are in place for a partial normalization would be the term I would use. So we'll see a relaxation of social distancing restrictions. We'll see more businesses open. BC, we're quite fortunate here. Ontario and Quebec, the UK this morning are in full lockdown mode, more or less. So, the vast majority of organizations are closed or operating remotely. That isn't the case in BC. We never shut down our manufacturing, our construction, and our natural resource industries, even in the worst of phase one. And today, you can still go to retail outlets. You can still go to dine-in restaurants in BC. We're a bit unusual. There's a lot of places in North America that isn't the case. So in a way, we didn't shut as much down. So we're perhaps not going to get quite as strong a rebound here as some other jurisdictions because we're starting from kind of a better place and there isn't as much activity to make up. But nonetheless, 2021, I think we will see growth in the economy probably in the 4 to 5% range after inflation on an average annual basis. And that more or less matches the decline that we saw in real GDP in 2020 on an average annual basis, just because of the collapse in activity that we experienced in the second quarter. We're gradually, getting back on top of that. But even by the end of 2021, we will not be back to the level of output or real GDP that we experienced at the end of 2019. So it's going to take another 18 months probably or longer to fully recover. And that assumes these vaccines are effective and that they're widely distributed. They do seem to be effective, but the distribution across Canada has been disappointingly slow, at least in these early weeks.
Fair enough, Jock. As always, a pleasure having you on the show. We'll have to touch base with you in BCBC a little later into the year to find out what's happening. Thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's Jock Finlayson, Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia. He has an Outlook column out today at biv.com, which you can check out. It covers much of the ground we've discussed in this conversation. I'm Hayley Woodin. This has been BIV Today. Thanks for listening and watching. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow.